I think opening the door and those channels kind of to folks and bringing them in as a part of the decision-making in the team and like, hey, they're a helpful set of inputs because they're the people that we're building for becomes really valuable. It also means that you have to be really good about recruiting.
Welcome to GrowthMates. This is Kate Suma, Growth Advisor, previously Head of Growth Design at Mira. Here you can learn how companies like Dropbox, Adobe, Canva, Loom, and many more are building excellent products and growth culture. Get all episodes and a free playbook for growth teams on our brand new website, growthmates.club. In this episode, I met with Behzod Sirjani, a leader in research space who worked in companies like Slack and Facebook and currently supporting the broader community as an advisor and Reforge partner. Research is one of my favorite topics, and we discuss how different companies should approach that from startup to scale up. By the end of this episode, you can learn how to get customer insights even in a small team, when it's the right moment to bring a dedicated researcher, common mistakes with that, and how to scale the research forward. If you find this show valuable, please share it with a colleague or friend. It greatly supports our efforts to continue creating it. To receive all episodes directly in your inbox and get a free growth playbook, subscribe to growthmates.club. With that, let's dive in after a short announcement. This episode is brought to you by Appcues, the platform that helps you design, deploy, and test captivating onboarding experiences in minutes, not weeks. Appcues created the Product Adoption Academy, which includes courses, templates, and examples to help you level up your product adoption, and you can use it entirely for free. Check out the 5-step growth flow review template, which I created to help companies connect growth hypotheses with behavioral patterns to uncover meaningful improvements. Find an example of Dropbox Onboarding inside and use this template to review any growth flows in your product. Get the template through the link appcues.com/growthmates. Hello, Behzod. Welcome to GrowthMates. I'm so happy to have you here this morning for you, this evening for me. How are you doing?
Doing well. I'm very excited to be here.
Awesome. So, user research and discovery are one of my favorite topics. When I saw your profile, I was like, yes, I want to talk to this person and I want to have this in-depth conversation about user research and how companies at different phases can use it well. So I'm so happy that we will talk about it today. And before we start, I usually want to ask all the guests about their personal stories and how they got where they are today. So you've been to so many amazing companies like Facebook, Slack, you were leading research ops there. Then you were advising a lot of amazing companies that we all know. You also created your own studio with a very nice name, Yet Another Studio, which I really like. And maybe you could tell a bit more how you got where you are today and what is the mission that you are currently driving.
Ooh, yeah. I think in some ways ending up where I am is sort of an accident, but also sort of inevitable. I grew up traveling a ton. My dad's from Iran, so we have a lot of family overseas. And he also works in technology. And so I grew up both communicating with a lot of people overseas, whether it was on the phone or then email and then, social platforms and traveling. And I was that nerdy kid who had an email address at 10, and I used to have email pen pals for kids that I met on vacations and stuff. So I think as I grew up, I was always curious about the role that technology played and felt like I was a little bit of an outlier. And when I got to college, it was or university, given some folks in the different audience. When I was in university, it was around the same time that Facebook basically became public for folks outside of universities. Twitter had kind of launched. Tumblr was a really big thing. And I was really interested in the way that those different platforms and being connected on those platforms shaped or influenced how we related to each other. So was it different that I was just a classmate of yours versus I was a classmate and a Facebook friend? How did that add layer or texture or understanding? And in university, I was super interested in a lot of the theory aspects of things. Actually, I thought I was going to go into psychology when I got into university, but I ended up taking a course my freshman the second semester of freshman year on new media and technology. And so we started with older, like kind of philosophical, like TV and representations of media, and then read through like William Gibson and pattern recognition, and then Borges and Manovich and like simulation, simulacra, and like the map isn't the territory. I just got really deep into this idea that the internet allowed for a range of behaviors that were different, mimic, new, chaotic, etc., compared to the physical world. And my advisor at the time was someone who was from Puerto Rico, and his research was all around the way that how communication changes in public when the public square goes from being a physical place to the internet, and whose voices are privileged or whatnot. So I got done with that, and I was very curious, but I had no real like practical skills since my degree was in rhetoric and media studies. Like I had a degree in common sense, I like to joke. And so all the people I saw who were at these companies doing things, people who were building Facebook and whatnot, all had advanced degrees. So I decided to go to graduate school and didn't really know exactly where I was going to be. So I didn't know if I wanted to go into like computer science or research or design or whatnot, and ended up at the University of Washington in their human-centered design and engineering program. And I think for me, that was probably the best place I could have ended up, because the whole department is very interdisciplinary. There's folks from English and the humanities. There's folks from information science, from computer science, psychology, design, communication, et cetera. And everyone there thinks about how do humans influence technology, and how does technology influence humanity? And there's a lot of work that they do on what are the different models that we have for technology, and like how that works, and how do we think about what we build and why we build it, and who gets to build, and all that kind of stuff. Which I think now, 12 years later, like sounds so obvious to how we think about things. But I think for me, being very young, and especially at that time when a lot of the HCI field was much more nascent, it was a really critical lens on things. And so anyway, long story short, I was really curious about why we build what we build. And I wasn't as fast at designing as people I worked with in graduate school, and I wasn't as good at building. And I was always the person who was talking to people like, oh, okay, like if we built this prototype, how would you use it? And I later realized that there was kind of an entire profession that was emerging of people who were doing this kind of social research. And I was really fortunate after that to go and do an internship at Microsoft Research in Fused Labs under Shelley Farnham. And we were building, I don't know that they would describe it this way, but essentially like a non-anonymous Reddit. And so we were really curious about understanding how do people interact in public if your real identity is tied to those interactions, which again, obviously, like there's a lot of different systems now in 2024, but in 2012, this was pretty unique. And it got me really excited about what doing research looked like in a company where you're learning things and then actually like building based off those learnings and iterating and stuff like that. And all of that eventually got me to Facebook in 2013, and getting to basically continue to do what I thought I was doing or what I wanted to do in graduate school, which was like work with people, study things, build better systems, and so on.
Wonderful. Well, such an interesting background and story. And now I see that there are even more interconnections, because I'm also very passionate about psychology. And I think one of the moments that I had in my career when I was at Mira, I've been doing both product design and user research 50-50 at some point, and sometimes even more user research than actual product design. And I've been at that moment like thinking about, do I really want to dedicate myself fully to that discipline? And even today, when I build in my own thing, I'm doing a lot of industry reports and researches, like, you know, to understand what's happening in the industry. So probably it's the most favorite part in the product development lifecycle for me. And talking about the next step, so like after Facebook, you also ended on Slack, also in a very interesting moment. Can you tell a bit more about your moment at Slack, what you were doing there?
Yeah. So Facebook, I like to joke, was kind of the PhD that I didn't know I was looking for. Like I actually started and dropped out of a PhD program and then ended up at Facebook. But I was there about 4 years during a really incredible time, both for the company and for research. When I started, there was about 30 researchers and about 3,000 people in the company. And 4 years later, when I left, there was about 300 researchers and 30-some thousand people in the company. So
crazy.
We almost doubled every year for 4 years, which was wild. But what that meant was that I got exposed to all sorts of really smart people at really important, like pivotal moments in growth. And I got to work on the first version of the Pages mobile app, the first version of some of our real like core video product and video infrastructure, the first version of Portal, a bunch of our ads tooling. And I think that provided a lot of really important lessons and frameworks for how I think about the role of research in driving growth. But I also was really curious about working in kind of different environments. And so fortunately, Christina Janzer, who helped build and kind of shepherd the research team at Facebook for over a decade, had left and gone to work at Slack. And the last like year and a half I had spent with her when she was at Facebook was building the Research Associates program, which was essentially like a junior research training program modeled kind of after Google's APM program. And so when I realized I wanted to go look for something beyond Facebook, I reached out to her and I said, hey, you're at Slack. It's a very different product. It's exciting for a lot of reasons. There are people who are paying, it operates in a different model, back to kind of my communication roots in a certain way. And ended up kind of interviewing and landing a role there. And at the time, our team was very small, like 4 researchers in a company of about 800 people. So already like a pretty different model from Facebook. And in talking with Christina, she wanted to keep the team pretty small. I think a lot of it was she spent a decade building this team at Facebook and she wanted to do things in kind of a different way. And so from the very beginning, she had a lot of support and buy-in from Stuart Butterfield, the CEO, about how we prioritize work. Rather than reporting into design, we actually reported into product. So Christina reported to April Underwood, who became our chief product officer. And it gave us a different kind of orientation to how do we think about what research should be focused on and driving towards. And I would say about a year, in the first kind of year or so in being at Slack, we had some people kind of shifting, some people left, we had some open roles. And one of the things that I kind of nudged Christina on was thinking about how do we more intentionally invest in kind of scaling the practice outside of scaling the team. And this was not like my idea. Like she was very intentional about how do we think about partnering and other things like that. But I was really curious about how do we more directly support and coach and mentor some of the other folks at Slack. And so I actually advocated for us to kind of move around some headcount and build out like kind of a more real like ops practice. And we were really fortunate to hire Nicole Anselmo, who actually recruited me to Facebook and had worked with Christina and I for a long time. And our first kind of division of labor when I brought Nicole onto the team was like everything that was research kind of in nature that then needed to be operationalized. So like survey templates, discussion guides, like that, I would own. And everything that was operational in nature, but for the research team, budgets, vendors, things like that, she would own. And that was kind of how we started building out the practice of just like, let's share a lot of context, but kind of live within our domain expertise, because Nicole is like a wizard at program management and scaling operation. And so we did that kind of for 2 years, just like building out a lot of the core infrastructure to support the company.
Wonderful. Just to add here, you reminded me about also the moment when I was introducing these ops and like processes of user research at Mira, actually before we hired the first user researcher to the company. Because, before you hire your first user researcher, who are these people who are doing research, product designers, product managers, of course, a bunch of other folks, and you don't have all of these tools and guides and everything starts from scratch. And after looking at that for a year, I realized, no, it's not how it should work, and started also building some foundation. So I think we will talk about that later in our discussion, when we will be discussing actually what is the moment when it makes sense to introduce any processes, right? And what might be more valuable ways to do research if you are a small team. And we will discuss it on different phases and stages. But maybe in a nutshell, before we jump into this in-depth discussion, can you tell a bit more about yet another studio? And for me, actually, because I'm also in the process of building GrowthMate as an umbrella for all of my services, including advising and one-on-one coaching and other like courses and practices. I'm very curious to learn how you're working with companies and building a studio, yet another studio for that.
Yeah, I got through almost 3 years at Slack. And one of the things about being in San Francisco and sort of the friends that I had was I saw a lot of people who were either founders or early product and design folks at companies that needed research help, but likely weren't going to hire a researcher. And so I'd always been doing, coffee chats and providing feedback on stuff here and there. But I got to a point at Slack where I thought we had built like a really good machine. And I was a little less interested in kind of scaling that machine than trying to figure out what does it look like to provide research support at stages really early in the process, especially in ways we don't know how to hire. And so I kind of left Slack and bundled a handful of different things that people were asking me to do into like a job. And I'd saved up and given myself some runway. And I said, great, here's like 6 months of runway. And if you run out of money, then you need to go find a job again. Otherwise, just try not to go broke. And I got really lucky because there were a couple conversations that I had turned into roles. I owe Kristen Torrey, who was running the research team at Figma, a huge debt because we had been talking about opportunities there. And she let me come in and I worked with them about half time for 6 months, kind of understanding how the world looked from like a broader research practice perspective. How did Figma engage with and learn from customers, and like what were different operational and structural and kind of human and non-human system changes they could make. And that was when Figma was like 250 people. So it was a really like early, interesting moment in their life.
Yeah.
But I basically took that and a handful of working with startups and just started to chip away at sort of finding ways to be useful. And I think I later realized that I'm sort of like a lion intellectually, and that I like to lay around and do nothing a lot of the time. Like I'm just kind of watching stuff and reading and whatnot. But when I get excited about something, I like use all of my energy to go chase it down. And so what I noticed in kind of the first year of the studio was I picked projects that were very different kinds of engagements, different types of work, different size companies. And I really tried to pay attention to what I liked and what I didn't like, what felt nourishing, where I felt like I was delivering outsized value and being high leverage. And I'm now I've run the studio for 4 years, so I'm in like year 5, which is kind of wild to say.
It's a long journey.
Yeah. It's been really rewarding. I've now like worked for myself longer than I've worked anywhere, which is wild. But I think what's easy to understand now that I don't know that I had the same understanding of then, or I think was more of a dream, was in my mind, research is very much like potential energy. Like it's always in service of something. And I think because I was at Facebook when I was, and like physically sitting in the office where I was very connected to a lot of the business conversations. And I was always like, I worked on the business side of the company. I was always thinking about revenue and growth and like, how do we build products that actually drive value? And so I think for me, like I was never happy just doing the research. I was always curious about why we were doing research and how that was going to help move the business forward. And I think there was this goal, not articulated necessarily, but kind of internally, of moving out of the research space and doing research in service of those other things, and then having more and more of those conversations. And it's interesting now because like when we're recording this, I'm working with 3 different clients and almost none of it is research related. A lot of it is product strategy and growth and hiring and board meetings and like all the stuff that research serves. So research has become part of the toolkit. But I think I've been able to do that because I've worked with like 40 companies in the last 4 years in various ways, and have done the like research and then research plus and then research and something else. And then like now a lot of the something else. But for me, I think the one thing that was clear from the beginning was I was always excited to work kind of on my own. And I've always really loved working with people that I respect and like working on stuff that I care about. And so when I started the studio, it was never to like build a huge agency. It was more to give like a permanence to the thing that I was doing and treat it like a real job and be like, Behzod is a person and like yet another studio exists and does this stuff.
Yeah.
And so I've continued to kind of grow it as a solo practice, which I think maybe adjacent to the conversation we're having today, but has led to a lot of like interesting other conversations around what does it mean to like work for yourself and what are some of those different modalities. And I recently tried to make sense of some of this in a post that I called Me as a Service. And it's just this idea of like, what are the different ways that you can sort of help, whether that's in service of individuals or in service of organizations, and to what extent are you accountable to deliverables or not? And like, how do you end up in this sort of kind of consultant versus teacher, coach, advisor world? And what does that look like? And happy to talk about any of that. But
wonderful. Yeah, absolutely. And it resonates so much because like, I'm on my solo journey for just over 6 months. And I wish when we talk maybe in 4 years, I will have such a huge portfolio as you have right now. And for me, the reason of creating Growth Mates started as a growth community of practice actually internally at Mira. And then it emerged into the podcast. And then I realized I'm doing other things that also relate to this mission of like supporting companies with both like understanding how to grow their products, but also creating a high quality, ethical user experience for that. And research is actually quite often is a component, is a tool to navigate and to find the ways how to find these new opportunities, research the first user experience. So this is where I think we are very like, have a lot of things in common.
Yeah, no, I think that's the thing that, I'm sure we'll get into this more, but in 2020, when everything was kind of chaotic, and I think there was a lot of rightful fear given everything going on in the world, I was more clear about a long-held stance I had that like everyone participates in research in some way, and certain people are better at doing certain kinds of research, or they're more qualified or more well-trained or whatnot. But research is innately human. Like humans are curious people, and researchers or people who are trained in research just happen to be a little bit more rigorous and structured about that curiosity often. But it's something we all do, whether it's, a founder trying to understand how to build a product or like you doing research on where you want to go on vacation. Slightly different, modalities and outcomes, but the kind of core practice feels very shared. And I always
you just reminded me how actually rewarding it is to do the research. And I just feel it in my body. Anyways, let's talk about actual things. And as I shared with you this idea for this episode, to make it valuable for different people with different backgrounds at different stages of the companies, we will split it into 3 parts. So the first part will be like actually discussing how to organize the research and how to approach it in a startup mode. The second will be in a more like at scale or before scale at Series A, B, and then when the company becomes like enterprise or scale up, how to move forward with that. So anyway, so let's start with the startup situation. I also remember when we had the first conversation with you, you said that you like treating founders as researchers, and I totally agree with that. So like founder is the first researcher in the team. And imagining that probably like, let's say I'm a founder in a startup, maybe just raised a seed round investment, so I have some budget, but I have a very small team, like less than 10 people, no dedicated user researcher, of course. So probably we both agree that founder is taking the role of the user researcher, but also somebody else in the team, maybe everybody in the team. But maybe you could tell more about your advice or thinking on that phase. What would be most relevant research methods that company can use at that phase, and what you would suggest to deprioritize, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think an important starting point, because I think a lot of people falsely believe that like a research practice gets built when you hire the first researcher, but the founder or the founders like picked a problem that they thought was worth solving, and they did some research to make progress on that. So I think it's important to understand that for a variety of reasons, one of which like it helps you understand how the company has historically made decisions and thinks about research. But we'll get into that. I think for advice for like really early stage teams, the thing that I encourage them to do tends to be focus a lot on the problem and like get clarity on what problem you're solving and who has that problem and how have they tried to solve the problem so far and what's worked and what hasn't worked there. And I tend to use kind of a pretty like straightforward Mad Libs style framing, like a fill in the blank type thing with a lot of the teams that I work with. And so they'll say like, oh, we want to like work on this project and we think we need to do research, or, maybe we should talk to customers. And what I have them do is basically like complete the following sentence, which is like, I would feel better about this project or effort if I kind of heard or observed, like one blank, some customer description, which is the second blank, saying or doing thing, which is the third blank. And what that allows us to do is be really clear about what evidence we need to move forward about this decision, like what we want to hear or see, who we want to hear or see it from. And then what we can do is ask 3 really important questions, which is this feasible, right? Like, is this possible for us to do? So if somebody says, oh, I want to go send a survey to Fortune 500 CEOs, I'm like, I don't think those people are going to answer your survey, right? Like maybe we need to figure out, is there another way we can get almost the same kind of evidence and move forward? The second question is like, is this reasonable for us to do, right? Is this actually a thing that makes sense and people would participate in, and like there's an even exchange, like can we do that? And then the third is this worthwhile? And so like, is this actually the highest leverage thing for us to gather the evidence we need to move forward? And I think those, like that sentence and those questions end up being really helpful forcing functions. I sort of joke with people, but it's not really a joke, it's just a helpful metaphor, that decision-making in companies is kind of like playing Wheel of Fortune. So you have some puzzle and there's some set of unknowns. Different people have different letters. There's a certain number of letters you want on the board to move forward. And like, you can all kind of agree like, hey, look, we're missing these 2 or 3 letters. We should go and get them. And we can talk about what it looks like, whether that's an experiment or a customer conversation or a design exploration or whatever that is, right? And so this also usually helps people understand like, oh, well, I would feel better about this effort if I could like watch 30 people go and use our product. And then you're like, given everything else that's going on in the company right now, maybe that's not worthwhile for us to do. Maybe that's going to take too long, or maybe it's not going to give us the level of like clarity or certainty that we need. And so then we can figure out what's a different approach. But what I most appreciate about this is that it's a very intentional way to scope research rather than just picking a method. And I think that a lot of people like go methods first. They're like, oh, well, I know how to interview people, so I'm going to do interviews. And I joked that again, not really a joke, but try to make light of the situation that like most people do what I call decision last research. So they like pick a method, they go gather some evidence, and then they try to make a decision with it rather than doing decision first research and saying, here's what I'm trying to decide. Here's the evidence I would need to make that decision. Here's how I can go and gather that. And I think if you're more decision first in your approach, you're going to waste less time, you're going to waste less customer time, and you're going to be able to gather evidence that actually helps you make probably this decision, but also subsequent decisions with more clarity and certainty.
Absolutely.
I know the second thing you asked there was like methods that I would recommend for folks. And I don't think it's a surprise, but like I find interviews to be the bread and butter of so much of early stage research, because you want to understand how and why people make decisions and do things and think through stuff. And you don't often have enough behavioral data at scale to like do really significant quantitative analyses. I also think that usability testing doesn't get enough love. Like, I think that having people go through a product and use it and click around and stumble and fall is just so valuable. And especially if you're doing moderated usability or like a think aloud protocol, the thing that I encourage people to do is kind of a 3-step process of asking someone what their expectation is about what's going to happen, have them react to the thing that happened, and then ask them to reflect on the difference between like what they expected and what actually happened. And I think gathering those 3 different data points at key moments in a moderated usability session can be really helpful in understanding and calibrating kind of users' mental models and expectations versus like what you actually built. The third thing that I find really valuable that I think is harder to execute on, but is really important, and I think is probably more important as people start building with AI and have less visibility into what's actually being used is either bringing on design partners or doing diary studies or betas or like some sort of longitudinal partnership where you are building with the people that you are trying to serve and regularly engaging with them about their feedback and understanding like, hey, we believe this should be solving your problem every day. Like, we're going to give it to you maybe for free, maybe at a discount in exchange for like the feedback to help this better. And I think building some sort of regular cadence of conversing with those people becomes really helpful. I've seen that done in Slack. Very biased there. But there's also tools that help you do that. And I think opening the door and those channels kind of to folks and bringing them in as a part of the decision making in the team and like, hey, they're a helpful set of inputs because they're the people that we're building for becomes really valuable. It also means that you have to be really good about recruiting, right? And I think that's a mistake that so many early stage companies make because they're like, I'm going to build a product and give it to all my friends. And I'm like, yeah, but if you're building a steakhouse, why did you just like invite a bunch of vegetarians? Like, I don't think they really care, but sure, they were like really easy people to get on board, right? And so I think all of these things, the caveat would be like, you still want to be really intentional about who you engage with because bad inputs lead to bad output.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And just to summarize everything you've shared, I totally agree with all of that. And I've been in situations when I wasn't at that early stage in the company. When I joined Miro, it was already over 50 people. So maybe the phase number 2 that we will be discussing will be more relevant. But what I loved the most in your approach is like, you need to be as close to customers as possible, as humanly possible. So, and research is actually becomes one of the primary work, day-to-day work as a founder. You are talking to potential customers and you are talking to the users who are sharing the feedback. And based on that feedback, you're building the product as they speak. And,
totally. And,
you know, I also like that you propose these diary studies, maybe in a different format, because sometimes I've noticed people become scared when they hear diary study as a method. They think it's very complicated and complex, but yes, it is. And you need to dedicate and you need to spend time on that. But this will be very rewarding data and amount of insight that you will take and scale. So maybe yeah, go ahead.
One thing I would add there, I think that there's both this element in terms of like company size, but I think this was also true even in bigger companies for certain initiatives. So when we were building in 2014, Facebook had like some Facebook video kind of playing, but like for the most part, we had a lot of YouTube videos playing in feed. And so we realized that we needed to like really invest in improving what Facebook video was. And so there was a small team of us that were dedicated to kind of building this out. And a number of us went and met with folks at Nike, at Sony, Universal, the Ellen Show, the Oprah Show, agencies, the Major League Baseball studios, et cetera. And like, we went to them and not just had conversations about what they cared about with video, but went and like looked at the actual systems that they were using to manage video clips and tag things. And like it was sat down with teams of people who did those workflows. And so to your point about like being close to the customers and like going to them, I think even when you're a bigger company, if you happen to be kind of spinning something up 0 to 1 or like, you know, incubating things that feel new, this is still a super relevant approach because, you know, for us, like we ended up building a whole new infrastructure and architecture for Facebook that was based on, oh, we need to treat video like a first-class citizen in the product. And to do that, we went and spent months with, you know, a whole bunch of people as if we were starting kind of from scratch. Obviously, we had a billion people using the product, so it wasn't from scratch, but like the video itself, like the video product was very nascent.
This is a very nice reminder because sometimes in a bigger company, you can be in a situation of a startup and you need to recognize these situations when you're building 0 to 1 things. And then the methods that you're using in a scale up can be not the right methods. So you need to go back in time and think about how you've done these things when you were building something from scratch. So maybe let's move forward with this evolution of the imaginary company. I should have probably created some name for my imaginary startup. But anyways, I'm still wearing the hat of a founder. Let's say my company have grown, we raised the Series A, maybe B, let's not be so ambitious, maybe Series A is good enough. and the company scaled. We already have like maybe around 100 people. But probably we are not still in the phase or like the moment when we decided, do we need to bring a dedicated user researcher or we are still good? Because I think at that phase when product managers, product designers, and other folks are doing the research on their own, they feel quite good about that and they want to continue doing this research and building this expertise. However, sometimes they feel already quite overwhelmed by doing everything on their own. Maybe could you tell a bit more, based on your practice, what are the key signals that can indicate that the company is ready to attract a dedicated user researcher, and what is the value of attracting a dedicated person?
Yeah, it's a very timely question. I'm working with 2 companies right now that have about 40 people, and we're having that conversation of like, do we need someone? Do we not? Like, what's the right time? I think given what we talked about and kind of, good research being, let's make sure that we're gathering evidence in service of making decisions. I think one of the signals that I push people to think about is how much time are you spending gathering evidence relative to actually making those decisions? So there's a company that I've worked with where the product manager and the designer are still doing a lot of the research, and it feels like it hasn't distracted from the other things that they're doing as a part of their day. They're working on a new initiative, they're updating this part of the experience, potentially building new features. And so in service of that, they're talking to customers, they're doing design exploration, et cetera, and doing research. And for them, it actually feels totally fine right now. To your point, they're not overwhelmed by it. Like, it's actually an important thing for them to directly engage in. But I think when you get to a point where there's too much of that, where you feel like there's this backlog of things that we need to learn or understand so that we can make good decisions, then it becomes easier for us. Oh, we actually should bring on someone to do this. And I don't think you need to wait. And in fact, I think you shouldn't wait until it feels like you have a full-time person's worth of research work to do. Because one of the things that the first person needs to do when they come in is starting to the comment you made really early on in this, like, they need to start building some of the infrastructure around how do we do this work. And so if I get hired as the first researcher as a company and I have so many projects that I can't think about, like, do we have NDAs in place, or have we done tracking or participants or any of that? Like, the projects themselves are going to suffer. So I feel like you end up in a place where if you have, a little more than half of a job for someone to do, and it feels like that work is ramping up, you're probably in a good place to start bringing them in. And hiring takes time, onboarding takes time, all of those things. So yeah, I would say if you feel like you have a full person's worth of work, you're probably a little late. But if it's just kind of a core part of people's jobs right now and it hasn't gotten in the way of them doing their work, I think you're fine.
Wonderful.
Because there's also,
yeah,
I think one of the big risks that people make when they hire is they then distribute all of the responsibility of like understanding customers to a researcher. And that really erodes a lot of the awareness and the trust in the company, because like no one else understands things. And you end up in this weird game of telephone where like, I went and talked to customers and now I'm going to tell you, like, your job is to like facilitate and structure the learning and the decision-making process. Some of that is I'm going to go do this on my own. Some of it is, hey, actually, Kate, you are doing this work really well. I'm just going to provide you a little bit of support. Keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. You reminded me about this moment, actually, when I was for a year, like taking the informal role of user researcher in addition to my product design role. And then the actual like first hire happened of the dedicated user researcher in the group. And you reminded me that there were like things that I realized finally that, yeah, it's so valuable to have one more person who can orchestrate, let's say, all of the research function. Because first of all, the issue is that whenever you're doing it on your own, product manager and designer are doing that, it's hard to evangelize insights because you have so many responsibilities. It's hard to share them. It's hard to advocate for them and to reuse them. And sometimes it becomes such a waste of time, to be honest. You are doing repetitive research all the time. Different people are doing the same research and they are not exchanging this knowledge. And the research outputs are not just utilized well. So I think it's just not effective in the end. So this is one thing. Another thing is like, leveling up team expertise, because yeah, we all can read all the best books and like use all these methods, but like we are not professional user researchers after all. So when like people who know how to do that, they come and they bring new methods, it levels up the whole discipline like in the company. I think for the same reason companies are attracting people like you, people like me, to level up the internal team expertise and to educate the existing team how to do things just in a bit different way. And the last thing I wanted to mention, so the recruiting aspect. So when I remember when I was doing it on my own, it was such a difficult job to recruit the right people, especially when we need to attract people who have never used the product before. And we need to do it a lot of times because, for example, to uncover new opportunities for activation and user onboarding, you need to talk to someone who have never used your product before. And sometimes it becomes very hard to find relevant people who can be your respondent. And if you're doing it manually, like in parallel with your prioritization, planning, design, etc., it's just inevitable that you will recruit not the best kind of customers or potential customers. And a lot of mistakes happen because of that.
Yeah. Yeah. The second point you made about leveling up, I think is such a good one. And right now, I think the most helpful frame I have for the work I do is I'm like a personal trainer for product organizations. So like it's a helpful metaphor because I tell people like I work with people who go to the gym but are not getting enough out of it. So I'm never going to convince you that you should exercise. But if you feel like you're doing exercises and they're not working, then I'm happy to work with you. But my job is like very much to make myself obsolete. Like I want to teach people good form. I want to help get them on the right track. But I'm not trying to be around forever because like I want to help this company become self-sufficient in those practices. And I've had a number of people where I've engaged for a while and then they're working out, they're getting healthier. And then they're like, oh, we need to level up again. It's like, great. Figure out what are the other processes or tools or systems we need to build, kind of to the point we're talking about, like at these different stages, right? When the practice evolves or the company evolves. But I think that framing, even for the first researcher who comes in or the first of anything, is a really good one because there's probably some existing practice that's there. And the question is, how do I make sense of what exists, what's working, what needs to change, and then like build a trajectory on which we can improve those things.
Sure. Yeah. And also on that note about the teamwork and how to make it successful in the research like function. So before we jump and discuss the last phase, like scale up and enterprise mode and the challenges with the research there, when we are bringing like the first user researcher, it can become quite, weird for the team, how they should do the research in that new mode and how they can be still close to customers because they want to be close to customers. So if you have any thoughts on that or any advice that you'd like to share.
Yeah, maybe we can piggyback kind of on where I was just talking about in terms of like understanding what is and isn't working. I encourage first person in any discipline to go in and kind of research the organization. And I wrote a piece about kind of understanding an organizational appetite for research, or like a palette, right? Like what are the things that people think research is? What do they like? What don't they like? What has worked in the past, et cetera? And like, I think your job very often is to make kind of a map of the world. And so with teams that I've worked with, I kind of encourage them to ask the like who, what, where, when, why questions. But for them, when you ask those about the organization, it's like, what data and insight does your organization need? Or who in your organization is going to use this? And how much do they need? And stuff like that. And how have they been servicing those things so far? Because I think to borrow one of my favorite metaphors, like sometimes research is like giving people a snack. Sometimes it's like giving people an entree. Sometimes it's like giving people a feast. But like a lot of mismatch happens when if someone needs like a quick understanding or a customer call and you give them a segmentation, like they're not going to think that research is really valuable. And so I think in those early stages of, how do you make sure people are still close to customers and how do you start really building the practice? Question of like, who needs snacks and who needs entrees and what kind of feasts do we need to plan for? Because all of those things take different amount of time for like prep. They take different amounts of time to metabolize. And so asking yourself, like, at what cadence are different teams making decisions? Which of these are more important for the business right now? How do I staff the kitchen and the fridge and like all those things? I think becomes kind of the starting point. And then the second thing is remembering that like you're not doing this all by yourself, and you shouldn't be doing this by yourself. And so given areas that maybe aren't high risk or priorities for you to directly do this research, how do you partner and support other people doing that work? So is that, hey, well, I'm going to hold office hours because I know that there are other people who are going to be talking to customers, and they're actually like, they're pretty good at it, but they just need some practice on what questions to ask, or like maybe some phrasing, right? Or people who are really good at writing discussion guides, but they don't feel as good at the practice part. So you're like, great, we'll do some practice sessions and like I can give you feedback and stuff like that. But I think you have to take sort of a multi like mode approach to that, where some of it is like, yeah, this stuff I need to work on because I'm the researcher and I have the trained expertise. Some of it is I'm going to support and partner with people. And some of it is like, cool, let's just like make it easy for anyone to go into the kitchen and grab an apple and feed themselves.
Awesome. You also reminded me about the office hours, because I would say it's a very valuable meeting and like even process to have at any phase, because like even if you are scaling up, these office hours can be utilized just to review, just to check in, just to understand if I just created a good question or not. So both product managers and product designers can join the office hours with their user researcher dedicated to their group and have it as an ongoing coaching practice on user research.
Totally.
I just realized that it's been used in different companies, and I would recommend to try it out if you don't have this yet. And moving forward, also like maybe landing on this final phase when the company is already quite big or becoming big, when there is a user research group maybe, and there is this theme of research ops that starts emerging. So could you share maybe some of the essential things that company needs to start implementing to make sure research will be scalable, maybe something from your practice at Slack? Because I think a lot of people who are listening to this podcast are working in quite large companies. So maybe they are missing something, maybe they need some fresh perspective, which will be always useful.
Yeah. I mean, I know Kate Towsey has a great book coming out about this that goes into a lot more detail, because I got to do a pre-read and provide a little quote and some feedback. And I'm sure that I took the thing that I'm about to say from her, but I definitely believe that if you're doing research, then you have research ops, whether or not you're actually like investing in it. And so the kind of two questions that I tend to ask companies when I start working with, regardless of whether or not they have any researchers, but I think is especially true when you get to scale, is like, how do we protect our customers and our business, first of all? And so that's like, what are the guidelines and guardrails we need to build, whether that's getting the right NDA forms or participant tracking or how we're paying people or any of that. So like, I want to make sure that the people we are trying to serve are protected and the business itself is protected. Right? We're like GDPR compliant and CCPA compliant if you're in California, so on. But then the second thing that I think about with a lot of the ops opportunity, I guess, is like, what's the highest leverage thing I can build? Or what's like the highest leverage kind of process or system that we need to be investing in? And I definitely don't believe that process makes things good, but I do think that process often prevents us from doing things poorly, right? Process is not about the ceiling, it's about the floor. And so the question is like, where do I need to sort of raise the floor on things, or centralize how we do things, or increase efficiency, et cetera? And very often you're taking kind of a crawl, walk, run approach to things. So one really good example from Slack was we had our team on the research side, and then also the customer success team sending out surveys to customers. And at first we were kind of doing this separately. And then we were trying to compare data, and we realized that we were asking different questions or asking the same question with different answer scales, all this kind of stuff that made it really difficult. And so we were like, well, one of the highest leverage things that we could do is actually create a better shared data set that made it so that any answers we got from any customers could be compared to any other customer. So that if like a large organization that doesn't use Slack is like, well, how satisfied or what are the benefits from other companies like us, we could say, great, hey, we actually have, not just someone on your customer success side that like works in that pod, but by the way, we can talk about everyone across all of Slack. So anyway, what we ended up doing was partnering really closely with the customer success team and kind of auditing the surveys they sent out and understanding why is it they're sending these surveys and at what touch points and intervals and stuff like that. And then we actually streamlined them and built a number of templates and a survey question bank, and then built all of this into Qualtrics, rolled out Qualtrics to the entire customer success organization, including like Loom trainings and support and a channel and office hours and all this stuff. And what it allowed us to do is have like better comparable data between kind of the core Slack tracking surveys that we ran on a quarterly basis and all of the stuff that the customer success team was sending out. And so now we had NPS on a more regular basis, satisfaction on a more regular basis, vertical specific data. And it was really helpful because from an ops perspective, it was the same thing that was happening in different places, but it didn't need to be different. And so I think when we took that lens of, okay, we're trying to make decisions, but we're making decisions with different data that shouldn't necessarily be different, it helped crystallize why this was like a really good opportunity for us to invest in and take on. It also was just from like a raw scale perspective, we were never going to hire enough people to go send all of those surveys. And we didn't think we should. Like the whole point was we could use our survey expertise and our operational expertise to build a scalable program and sustain that rather than try to hire people. And I mean, I think honestly, like in the year after we rolled that out, the customer success team sent out more surveys than we did, which in my mind is like a huge win because it's like, oh, great, you're not just doing this, you're doing more of this than we are, but with the same number of people that we already have.
Super fantastic. So moving forward and maybe finalizing this discussion on this scale up enterprise, whatever phase when you already have research at scale, what are the most maybe common mistakes or cracks that you've seen in addition to what you already mentioned that companies are experiencing at scale and maybe how to avoid them?
I think a bunch of the stuff that comes to mind probably isn't a surprise, but some of the mistakes I see a lot of people make is just having research teams validate what's going out before it goes out, which I think isn't great. People being really siloed and not talking to teams. Researchers thinking that their job is to just do research and then like they kind of like throw the research over the fence. They're like, look, I learned a thing, and it's like totally removed from the decisions that are being made. I think, you know, companies are in a pretty hard spot right now. We're recording this in June of 2024. It's been a chaotic few years for a lot of people in different ways. And to the title of this podcast, like we're on growth mates. And I think that something you and I probably believe that I wish more people in the industry understood is that growth is everyone's job. And I am like very much of the Brian Balfour and Elena Verna school of growth, where like growth is acquisition and retention and monetization. And like everything that you work on in a company is about acquiring the right customers, to driving enough engagement that they retain and get value from the product, and then monetizing effectively to support the business. And so if you are not doing that, I'm not really sure what you're doing in the company, with the exception of like, you know, HR operations kind of like supporting general company functioning. But like if you work on product or anything associated with product or go to market, your job is growth. Like unequivocally, the thing that you are supposed to be doing is helping your company grow. And so if you feel like the things you're working on do not drive acquisition for the right customers, are not helping drive engagement and retention, or do not help support how you monetize, like probably go work on other stuff in the company, because those are the things that are most helpful. And so I think from an ops perspective, like if I think everyone in the company is trying to drive growth, my job is saying, what are the systems and processes and tools and other things I can do to help people be more effective and efficient at doing their job to help us get to that outcome, right? Great. Let's all get on Qualtrics. Now we don't have to deal with all these other vendors. I'm going to hold office hours so that every customer conversation is better. I'm going to do interview training for the sales team so they know how to ask better follow-up questions. Like, I think too often we feel beholden to job descriptions the way that they're written. And like the mistake or the cracks companies experience is like people hiding behind their role. Like your job is to go help your company grow. And if your manager isn't telling you things to do that are going to do that, like go figure that out for yourself, because that's what's going to, you know, ultimately keep you employed. And really, I think it becomes a much more helpful skill for you to like be more heads up and say, hey, how can I leverage my skills and expertise to be helpful in doing something that the company needs, rather than being really heads down and just like waiting for work to come your way.
Wonderful. I love that. Surprisingly, we ended up talking about growth on this podcast finally. I love it. And again, thank you so much for so many insights. I hope we will create some format of like a blog post afterwards to make it easier to look through for all our listeners. And maybe also before we jump into traditional lightning round, I want to mention that you're running fantastic courses on Reforge. And for anyone who wants to level up their expertise, I totally recommend to explore them. We will add the links to the episode description. And finally, the tradition with this lightning round. So I couldn't avoid this question, but what is maybe one of your favorite user research questions that reveals some interesting insights from customers? Anything that comes to mind?
I think my favorite question is probably why, which is maybe a bit of a cop-out, but it's also one of the things that I include in a lot of my trainings when I do like company trainings or I'm having conversations with early stage folks. I say like 2 of the most powerful words you can learn are why and how, because you have so many people who go into these conversations and they say, would you use this? Or do you use it? Et cetera. And you get these kind of closed off, like yes, no answers that end the conversation. But if I say, why do you use this? Or how would you use it? Right? You end up in this, I'm opening up all of this space for conversation. And I think for interviews, especially, whether you're early stage or late stage, like trying to understand why and how becomes so important, because our job as researchers is not to go out there and like have customers validate the way we think about the world. We're going out there to make sure that we understand how our customers understand the world, right? And so that's not me going out and be like, yes, no, yes, no, cool, right? I'm done. Like, oh, well, Kate, like, how do you feel about that? Or, I'm a little confused probably from my own experience, can you tell me a little bit about why that comes up or how that makes you feel? Whatever those things are, right? Like the goal is to kind of continue to expand the space of conversation and increase the surface area. So yeah, I don't know. If you don't learn anything else, like the word why.
Yeah,
very
fantastic.
Powerful.
It also helps me design these interview guides. I actually use the practices that I learned from user research to design these interviews with guests. So thanks for the reminder. The next question, what are some of the resources or books that inspired the themes and the topics that we discussed today that you'd like to recommend?
Yeah, maybe to the point where you're talking about around growth, like I think that most researchers are pretty competent at methods. I don't think anyone needs to go read another book about how to, but I do think that most people don't understand why they do the work that they're doing. So I would like some of the best resources I would point people at, unsurprisingly, are probably like Reforge courses on growth. I think Elena, Brian, et cetera, are all really smart. I've spent 4 years learning from them, and it's been so helpful for my career, for the companies that I've worked with. I also am a big fan of Jan Chipchase's book, The Field Study Handbook. I think it's a book written about how to do field research, but I think it's actually a book about how to look at the world that you're moving through and be like thoughtful about that. And so I think it's something that everyone benefits from, even if you're not in research. And then having just read it, like Kate Towsey's upcoming book on research that scales is great. And I will encourage everyone once it comes out to read it, whether or not you're in operations or not, because I think it's actually a book about how do you strategically build a practice and think about what it looks like to scale a practice.
Lovely. I will make sure to add these books to the bookshelf of GrowthMates websites. And I hope when we will release this episode, it will be already finalized and ready to ship. And the last question, because the GrowthMates is GrowthMates, and it's becoming something beyond just myself, and it's becoming a place for all of us to connect. Who might be some people who you'd like to see on this show someday? Any recommendations are very welcome.
Yeah, anyone I've mentioned, Kate would be a great person. I'm a big fan of Dave Hora and his writing. We both kind of started our independent practices around the same time. I think he was a bit ahead of me. And so Dave has been just like a really helpful person as I navigate this world. And I think we both probably write a lot more academically in private than we share publicly. So he's been a really helpful person for me to nerd out with. And I actually think the third person that I would recommend is my friend Tom Critchlow. He's been an indie consultant almost 10 years now, but he came out of SEO. And so he used to do a lot of like SEO consulting and helping companies grow through that. And I think similar to me, Tom, if you're listening, I apologize for the disservice that I'm doing to your wonderful work. But I think Tom is also a really good person at shifting between micro and macro when it comes to business issues. And he's not afraid of rolling his sleeves up and like getting his hands dirty. And so he's very good about helping companies navigate like the most important thing. And he works in this really like hands-on kind of advising role to do that.
Awesome.
Yeah. And maybe the last person, just now that I'm thinking about something like
we can make more than 3, of course.
Perfect. Eli Lerner is another great person. He's like a product and growth advisor. He ran the consumer business at Yelp and ran product at Chime, and like also has been around in kind of the Reforge group. But he does a lot of really, really good like hands-on work with early stage companies and growth. And if you work in marketplaces, he's like the person you should talk to. And so I've learned so much from him because I think like consumer is hard in certain ways and enterprise is hard in certain ways, but like marketplace is hard for like a lot of the intersections of those things. Yeah. And so for me, like even just our conversations about marketplace dynamics and how you approach that from a product and a business perspective have had tons of cascading implications on how I think about building consumer or enterprise businesses.
Fantastic. So many recommendations. I will come back to you and ask you to introduce me to some of these people. Fantastic people. And yeah, thank you again so much for this valuable discussion. It took a bit more time, but I think it's been very insightful and I'm looking forward to sharing it with the audience. And good luck with all the things you are doing. You are doing like great things, serving a great mission, and we need more folks on the market like you. Yeah.
Thank you. This has been so lovely and excited to see you kind of continue on your journey and support that.
I will trying my best. Awesome. Thank you so much. And enjoy your week. Cheers.
You too.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe to the show on growthmates.club and get free playbook with frameworks and insights. If you find this valuable, please share it with your friends and colleagues and subscribe to the show on your favorite platforms to get new episodes. Let's keep growing together.